Digital Foundry is sponsored by Backtrace, the leader in crash and error reporting for game developers. Click on the link in the video description and sign up for your free trial today.
Bagley, tell me you're close.
I'm through security, now wading through terrifying people.
Returning again to Watch Dogs Legion now for the third time, it seems like this game may be my next generation nemesis, like Rise of the Tomb Raider became for our John Linneman. But, like John before me, we do actually have new information to talk about here with the cross comparison of the next generation consoles of Series X, Series S, and PlayStation 5. To get right to the less important bits, I would say, I can confirm right away that Xbox Series X and PlayStation 5 do indeed run at nearly the exact same visual settings as was discovered locked away in the PC version in its config files. This is most readily evident in side-by-side comparisons of the ray tracing that this game uses for its reflections, the premier visual feature on next-gen versions of this game. So if you put a window shot, for example, of the Series X next to the PlayStation 5, it's possible to see how the cutoff for objects in the reflection, as in the distance in which they're added, is the exact same on both versions, like you can see in the street here. This distance is of course mirrored on Series S, which uses the same setting. If you go over to look at other areas of the game, it's possible to see how the ray traced reflections apply to the same amount of surfaces, like here in front of the underground station, where all the same surfaces receive the reflections. And likewise, by looking directly in a reflection itself, like here on the floor in the beginning of the game, it's possible to see how the internal resolution of the reflections is the exact same on PlayStation 5 as it is on Series X. And as discussed in my previous video, Series S of course uses a lower internal resolution for its ray traced reflections. In terms of all other settings, Series X and PlayStation 5 are going to be the exact same essentially. So the same texture resolution is used, which is seen very easily in the game's first section when looking at the environmental textures. The same shadow map resolution is used as well, and the same geometric LOD distance. Series S is a slightly different story, with lower resolution shadows as well as lower geometry LOD range, which can be seen in many shots on Series S when you progress forward just by walking, and you can see the LOD pop in, I would say more egregiously. In direct comparison to the other consoles, this means distant objects like this building's window here are under-detailed on Series S, where they are higher detailed on Series X and PlayStation 5. Going through the config files I found on PC, I was also able to find out that the fallback reflections for RT reflections with the real-time Q maps are lower resolution on Series S and have a lessened distance for which buildings are included in them. And going in-game to check this out, I could confirm this with this shot here, where you can see an obvious lower resolution in the fallback reflection, as well as the fact that the buildings themselves in the reflection at the end of the alley are missing on Series S, but present on PlayStation 5 and Series X. Another difference comes in textures. So while Series S will have the same texture resolution, its lower caching of textures combines with a generally low level of anisotropic filtering, which turns textures at any distance from the camera into a kind of soupy, blurry presentation. It generally does not look too great, and I'm a little bit confused why anisotropic filtering is reduced at all here. Speaking of anisotropic filtering, for some reason Series X also has slightly lower AF than PS5, which can be seen at this shot here on the bar countertop, where the Series X texture at a distance fades into a more blurry presentation that is not all present on the PlayStation 5, which keeps sharp. Looking at the config files on PC, Series X and PS5 use the exact same ultra quality of 0 for AF, while Series S has an explicit enumeration lower for texture filtering. So in the code, the AF level is the same, so maybe we're looking at a bug as to how it was actually implemented on the Series X console. Another minor inconsistency across the versions is that puddles are completely missing in reflections on PlayStation 5. Perhaps this is just some sort of Spider-Man joke gone wrong, but it's something that's not present in the configuration files that we have access to, so this is perhaps just a bug and not intended behavior. When you do take Series S out of the question, the next generation console versions of this game in PlayStation 5 and Xbox Series X and side-by-sides look basically identical. And I had trouble myself when editing this video to make sure I was lining up shots correctly, and I had to really look at the file names and labels I was using. One thing that is not identical across these platforms are loading times. To test this, I progressed the game to the same area on all platforms and quit the game and reloaded up the save so that it loaded the exact same location. When doing this, I found that the PlayStation 5 loaded that same area in a little over 18 seconds, and the Series X and S in a little over 26 seconds, so basically the same. A nice little win here on PS5, but I don't find the loading times actually that impressive in this game in general, and I honestly expected better. Getting over to resolution, we're looking at another mirror-like scenario on PlayStation 5 and Xbox Series X. Remember that scene from my last video on Watch Dogs where I used it in a pivotal manner to see how close a PC GPU was to the Xbox Series X? Well, the PlayStation 5 in this scene gets extremely similar resolution counts to the Series X, where I counted 93 out of 100 pixels, for example, when moving the camera here. That's a difference of 1 pixel from the 94 out of 100 resolution count that I got in the last video with Series X here. In another scene, as the car drives by, on both consoles, I see the resolution dropping to 92% on both axes. In another scene, I see it going down to 90% on both axes on both consoles, and so on and so forth. We're going through a variety of scenes, and doing counts like this, I was able to determine that those areas where resolution scaling occurs produce basically the exact same result on Xbox Series X and PlayStation 5. And from what I'm seeing in this game, the resolution scaler is very fine-grained and very reactive, where it can change very quickly and in small amounts. And I'll talk more about this later when we get over to performance. As we know from the PC configs in both these versions, the minimum resolution should be around 1440p. The general gameplay I have seen though will see the resolution going down to around 80% or even staying at 100% to 4K for resolution on PlayStation 5 and Xbox Series X. Really only the night sections of the game with a lot of cars, lights, and reflections push the resolution down on both consoles closer to 1440p. Or those scenes in parks with a lot of vegetation taking up the screen also tend to be pretty heavy. Going over to Series S, where its lowest resolution bound is 900p, I actually found myself surprised how often I would get a straight 1080p count in areas where I might see resolution dips on Series X and PS5. The closer dips to 900p occurred in those same areas that I said were troublesome earlier, like at night or around a lot of vegetation. I am surprised here because I thought the image quality in a lot of sections of this game looked quite a bit worse than 1080p, and I think this is due to how low resolution the ray traced reflections are, which impact the image quality quite a bit. The RT reflections on Series S add in a lot of noise and aliasing, as they're essentially checkerboarded 720p in quality. This same principle applies to Series X and PlayStation 5 of course, but just to a lesser degree due to how much higher resolution the games are and how much higher resolution the RT is. But how do these versions look in terms of performance? Going back to my colleague Tom's work covering this on last gen consoles, he found out that those machines could struggle. Looking at the base Xbox One and PlayStation 4, driving around in those versions would cause dips below 30 FPS rather often, with the base Xbox One seeing frame rates in the middle 20s. The extra grunt of the upgraded machines of the PlayStation 4 Pro and Xbox One X though largely smooths out those areas with only some smaller occasional dips if you really pushed a machine like the Xbox One X hard by inducing mayhem. Given the lackluster performance there on something like the Xbox One, I can happily report that every single next-gen version here of Watch Dogs Legion performs perfectly across the board. All versions target 30 FPS and quite literally never drop a single frame from that 30 FPS target, no matter what is happening on screen. Every single version is always hitting 30 FPS. Even the Xbox Series S, with its ray tracing, combining with its lower GPU and memory spec, has absolutely no issues getting 30 FPS. I did not miss a single frame in my entire 3.5 hours of play in the game. This makes for uninteresting headlines, but it's a good one for the players. If I were to guess as to why we're seeing such consistent performance here on the next gen machines, I would imagine that the last gen machines were CPU limited in many cases when even trying to get up to 30 FPS. Now with Zen 2 CPUs, The next-gen consoles have no problem getting to the 30 FPS limit that this game imposes, as the CPU is probably not very stressed at all, even with the extra CPU cost that ray tracing would entail. Instead, I would assume that the GPU is the primary limiter in performance here, given the ray tracing and high-resolution targets. You would imagine this might mean some dips in more hectic scenes, but the dynamic resolution scaler seems to be doing an excellent job, where I could count very fine-grained differences in resolution happening very quickly. So once again, these are all great things. Given this smooth performance, I do wonder if a 60 FPS optional performance mode could be added in to see how the console CPUs manage. According to the config files found on PC, there was a 60 FPS mode in the works for PS5 and Xbox Series X at some point, but it's not available in the retail version of the game and perhaps may come at a later point. The most interesting part of this analysis for me is the fact that the Series X and PlayStation 5 look the exact same. They have the same resolution drops and graphical settings, with only what I can assume are bugs differentiating them. With them being so similar, I do wonder why the extra GPU compute and bandwidth of the Series X are not coming to bear at all in the numbers. With high resolutions and RT reflections, I would imagine the Series X would do better. But as to why, I'm not sure at the moment, and that is speculation I will leave to the future. And until then, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did enjoy it, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. If you're already a subscriber, then please consider hitting that little bell in the corner to be informed as soon as Digital Foundry posts a video. If you want to help us out, support Digital Foundry on Patreon to get years worth of Digital Foundry content available in high quality for download. If you want to talk to me about this game or anything else, write a comment below or follow me and Digital Foundry on Twitter. And as always, this is Alex, bidding you farewell und auf Wiedersehen.
Don't lose players to game errors and crashes. Instability will happen throughout the game development cycle during playtesting, beta cycles, or after you've released. Backtrace was developed to automate the capture and analysis of crashes, hangs, and non-fatal errors across PlayStation, Xbox, Nintendo, PC, Mac, Stadia, and more. Our unique data platform allows you to index anything, integrate with Jira, Slack, Discord, and run analytic workloads to better prioritize and understand your game's stability. Many of the industry's AAA studios depend on Backtrace. You should too. Click on the link in the video description and sign up for your free trial today.